My wife. I think she drowned. Son. I just can't hear him like that, you know? It's just, you can't tell me that when you hear that, you don't believe him. I knew that my father did not kill my mother. As long as he's still in prison, I will never let it go.
I'm looking at these pictures and going, wow, because you see her neck with a large, substantial hemorrhage to it. You have almost 17 injuries on the body. It looked like she almost went through a washing machine. Something happened in that tub. Something violent happened in that tub.
She had significant water in her lungs. There was no question she drowned. The issue in this case was manner of death. Was it an accident? Was it a suicide? Was it a homicide? The first thing we had to do was try and figure out what happened in that bathtub.
You lose your spouse, and then you're going to try and convict him of murder? He didn't kill her. It was an accident. I had a mini stroke from all the pressure of everything that was going on. And Frank couldn't be put in prison for something he didn't do. It was just a really hard time. It's not just what's happening to Frank, but what's happening to our entire family.
It's like they go backwards before they go forward.
There's that first Christmas in 1999 when I was brought home and we have the video. It's great. It's just seeing me, my mother, my dad, and they're just oogling over the baby and everything. She was only alive for 3 months, longer than that. Three months after I was brought from Russia, adopted by my two parents, Cynthia passed away. For me, just not having a mother was the main issue for me growing up. But then I just started thinking that it's not about that anymore. Right now, the focus needs to be on my dad and defending him.
Tell me where your father currently is.
So my dad is at Menard Correctional Facility in Chester, Illinois. The police say that my father killed my mother, but the story they're saying happened, we know did not happen. We're just gonna keep fighting for his innocence, no matter what. And this is just gonna be a memory one day.
February 28th, I got a call at 2:30 in the morning. It was my brother Frank on the phone calling, yelling, "She's dead, she's dead." And then I heard Frank say, Cynthia's dead. And I'm like, oh my God, Frank, your mind goes crazy. You just bolt out of bed. You're totally awake. It's like from sleep to instant awake. When I first saw my brother, I went through the front door that night. I ran up to him and I grabbed him and hugged him. And he broke down. I broke down. We both cried. You know, he was sobbing and I just held him. Cynthia was 95, maybe 98 pounds. She liked things very hot because she had arthritis. And she probably was dizzy and passed out in the hot tub. That's all I could think that could possibly have happened. That night was such a nightmare. It was like something out of a movie. I knew she was dead. I knew that he called the police, of course. I don't remember thinking anything except, oh my God, this is just unreal. It's hard reliving all of this. So it's hard.
My wife, I think she's drowned. Oh my God, oh my God.
When you hear that 911 call, what do you hear?
A murderer. Without a doubt. On the night on February 28th, I was on patrol right down the street from the house of the Bushowers and got a call for assist the ambulance. So when I got to the house, Mr. Bushower answered the door in a panic and said that his wife had drowned. Obviously, at that point, I did check for a pulse. I checked her body temperature. It was, obvious that she was deceased.
I need paramedics rolling up here immediately. We've got a drowning victim.
I pressed on her neck, and then blood started coming out of her nose area. That person's been deceased for a while. There was nothing on her neck that night that would indicate any type of injury externally. Frank said that he went to bed and that Cynthia basically was going to take one of her whirlpool baths. And then some point at, I think around like 2-ish, he hears the baby crying and he woke up, went in there and discovered that she was in the tub. So he reaches in, grabs her and pulls her out. And at that point, takes her and put her on the floor and he calls 911. But when I looked at him, I didn't see wet clothing whatsoever. And he just said that he reached into a full tub of water and pulled her out. You should be soaked. There wasn't water all over the place. There wasn't things knocked down. If I found my daughter in a tub and was drowned, I'd pull her out and I'd probably knock everything over. So his story just wasn't making sense. I think that everybody else that was there, including the investigator and the evidence technician, also felt that same way, that it required substantial follow-up. As a patrol officer, I was just there to assist. And at some point, after I think the body was removed, I was cleared and went home. But when I left the house, there was a feeling with myself. I knew that something was definitely odd about it. Something happened in that tub. Something violent happened in that tub.
They went to Russia and they adopted David on Thanksgiving Day. He was, I believe, 9 months old when they adopted him. It was a special day. I mean, I was thrilled that they were going to have a child. I was happy for him. I think that's something he really in his heart wanted. And to have a son was, just a thrill. They were talking about adopting maybe a little girl next. Then all of a sudden, she's gone.
This is a letter that was authored by Frank to Cynthia. Our arguments have been extreme at times to the point where rather than withdraw, I am now on the attack. I have already threatened you physically, and if we cannot resolve our conflict in a constructive manner, then divorce is better than assault or murder. There was multiple letters, and they were a back and forth. This is them speaking to us, to each other. And some of the stuff that was in the letters was pretty drastic and pretty harsh. That's motive for murder.
They were going to a marriage counselor. The writing back and forth was something that the counselor encouraged them to do. And they used statements out of a book, The Peacemaker, that they used as a guide, a marriage guide. I think that divorce is better than assault or murder was taken from that book. They were having so many personal issues. They were totally different people. She was very materialistic, but Frank was not. Cynthia liked everything very grand, and she could be a very hard person to deal with sometimes. He gave her everything she wanted, and it wasn't good enough for her. Yes, he was frustrated with her, but no, he didn't kill her. It was an accident. She passed out from that intense heat and drowned in her hot tub.
They interviewed a lot of people in the course of their investigation back in 2000. They learned that there was an enormous amount of strife in that marriage. Cynthia told friends in the days before she died that he was like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that he would be calm and normal, and then all of a sudden he would blow up in anger. She had significant water in her lungs. There was no question she drowned. But she also had a deep bruise in one area of her neck. She had fresh scrapes, abrasions on her knee, on her knuckles, on both hands, on her nose, on her chin. The issue in this case was manner of death. Was it an accident? Was it a suicide? No. Was it a homicide? A week after Cynthia died, Frank went down to the police station and was interviewed by investigators from the Illinois State Police. He talked about the fact that they were having marital difficulties, and there came a point during that interview when the investigators showed Frank Cynthia's autopsy photos. And they were pointing out the injuries. And Frank made a comment to them that I might have killed her and I just don't remember. Who says that? I wouldn't call it a confession, but they're very incriminating statements.
Well, I don't think it's a confession. I think it's confusion. Confusion on his part. I told Frank, how can you remember something you didn't do? You know, how can you remember something that never happened? But the police kept pushing that because they wanted a conviction. They wanted to get their man. Well, there was no man to get.
The detective went to the state's attorney's office and spoke to an assistant state's attorney that was there at the time and said, here's what I have. And he was told, yeah, you don't have enough for a homicide.
At the end of 2 or 3 weeks, the case pretty much came to a full stop. I was actually just a patrol officer answering the calls and doing traffic stops like a normal police officer usually does. I would drive around South Barrington and I'd drive by his house and I'd point out, I'd say, there's our unsolved homicide right there. And I'd point to the house. I was frustrated myself because I knew that someone was murdered and somebody got away with it.
Thank you.
Okay, what's wrong? My wife. I think she drowned.
I'm sorry. I just can't hear him like that, you know? It's just, you can't tell me that when you hear that, you don't believe him. You know, you don't believe that he was hurt. And what kind of lack of emotion does a person have to say, no, he was lying? My father acted as both roles in my life. He acted as my father, and he acted as my mother.
Oh.
But that really worked for him because he is such a gentle person for someone who had never been a father in his life and is in his mid-50s at that point. It astounds me how great of a father he was able to be for me.
When I was asked in 2010 to become a detective, I asked the chief at the time, can I open that up? And he said, sure, go for it. After 10 years, there was no new evidence, but I just knew that it deserved another try. The case was contained in a banker's box, box 162. I'm looking at these pictures and going, wow, because you see in the medical examiner picture her neck with a large, substantial hemorrhage to it, which doesn't happen in an accident. There wasn't anything that we saw on the neck that night. But when they did the autopsy and extracted the neck from the body, that's when you saw it. There was petechia in the scalp and eyes. It's hemorrhaging basically in spots. It's seen in suffocation cases. You have like almost 17 injuries on the body. It looked like she almost went through a washing machine. Dr. Denton was the original medical examiner. When I called him, he goes, I knew this was a homicide and I've been waiting for you to call me. On the morning of her autopsy, there was no law enforcement official there with Dr. Denton. How that happened, I don't know. He didn't get all the reports. So if he had those reports, he would have ruled it a homicide.
I read all the police reports, the autopsy report, everything that was in the file. I said to him, it sure looks like a homicide. The first thing we had to do was try and figure out what happened in that bathtub. We removed the bathtub from the home and brought it to a fire department. And we had the water death expert come out, and she spent an entire day doing reconstructions in a bathtub filled with water.
We were trying to show how it happened so we can show a jury or a judge or anybody, this is what we believe happened. When I arrived at the house, Frank Bushauer was wearing, from what I recall, pajama pants and a t-shirt. His clothes were dry. During that time, I was noting, like, nothing is knocked down. There wasn't water all over the place. Our recreation models that were the same height and weight as Cynthia and Frank, every time that we did a new recreation, we would change out the pajamas. Fresh ones would go on. Is it wet? Is it not? When we had the person do it, he was soaked. If she's in a full tub and you went in to go grab her out, you would get wet somewhere. We also did scenarios of how did he pick her up out of a tub full of water and not knock down a single item. We determined that you had to pick somebody up with such precise care and lift them over those items.
I do think that there was probably acts of cover-up. The changing of their clothes, the setting of the items back on the tub, and probably a lot of time just spent thinking, I'm going to call the police. I've got to convince the police this was just a drowning. So I think a lot of that was taking place during that time. And the final test trial we did with the water death expert was a homicidal drowning test trial. And the purpose in doing that was to determine, how did she get these injuries? Frank Bushauer model was forcibly holding down the Cynthia Risco model, and her hands were flailing and hitting the jets.
We all looked at each other and were like, that's it right there. This is what happened, because our model was getting the same injuries that Cynthia had. She was cutting her knees. She was getting a bruise on her nose. She was getting the same exact injuries that Cynthia had. And the struggle that they had in our mock one was mere seconds. And the one that happened for real happened much longer. I believe that he pushed her in that tub and killed her.
Under manner of death, he changed it to homicide. And under how injury occurred, he changed it to forcibly submerged in a bathtub. At that point, I felt we had enough to arrest Frank Bushauer.
On April 24th, 2013, I was in 8th grade. And as I'm walking, I'm greeted by police officers. My stomach just drops. I thought I did something, like I was in trouble. So as I sit down, they explained to me that my dad had been arrested. And I remember asking them, I'm like, well, how many parking tickets did he get? And I was left thinking to myself, what are you talking about?
Are you okay?
Like this happened already? I've never heard anything about this. I knew that my father did not kill my mother. That first night, I didn't sleep in my own bed. I went to his room and I just went on the bed and I just broke down. You know, I broke down. I was alone in the world.
We just asked him to come voluntarily with us, and if he said no, then we would inform him that there was a warrant. I think it was our goal on that day to get a confession, of course.
So February 28th, 2000.
Worst day of my life.
Yeah, I can imagine. Very traumatic, right?
We showed him a lot of the medical examiner photos.
Looks like there's some injuries on her knuckles. And do we know how that happened?
I have no idea.
You guys didn't get in any kind of scuffle or anything like that prior to her taking the whirlpool?
We asked him, how did you pick her up out of a wet, full tub, as he claims, pull her out of the tub, put her on the floor, and then when I meet you the first time, you have dry clothes? How did you accomplish that?
I went around the top of her waist, right under her arms, pulled her over to the side of the tub and onto the floor.
Would you mind showing me how you picked her out of the tub? So he goes, yeah, sure, I did this, and then I did this.
Okay. You didn't get wet by pulling her out of the tub?
If I did, it was very minimal.
Okay. How about her? She had to be wet when you pulled her out of the tub?
Oh, yeah.
Was the floor wet?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
He really just didn't have an answer for it.
What do you think happened? Do you think this is... do you think this is accidental or do you think it's a homicide?
I would certainly come to that conclusion after looking at these. I would think it was a homicide.
But the issue is, nobody else did this. You're the guy. So...
Well, that's what I would certainly think.
He's dipping his feet in the pool of confession. He's not doing it all the way, but he's stepping into it.
The only way I could have done this would be that without any recall, because I don't recall anything. And that's the truth.
Are you sorry you married her?
Yes.
Even to this day?
To this day.
The interview ended just right after that. From the interview room, you can actually just walk him right down the hallway into the jail.
Never, ever thought this would come up again. Ever. Frank was very naive. He thinks in facts. What happened to her? Why did she die? He was thinking they're trying to figure out the cause, not really thinking he's the cause. This was not the cause of her death. Those jets were on, pushing her body around. So she had a lot of bruises on her knuckles from where the body was dragged around. You lose your spouse, and then you're going to try and convict him of murder? And I woke up about 4 a.m, and I was very dizzy. The whole side of my face was numb. My family took me to the emergency room, and they said, yes, I had a mini stroke. It was just all the pressure of everything that was going on. And Frank going to be put in prison for something he didn't do. And it was just a really hard time. So anyway, that's what happened to me. I mean, it's not just what's happening to Frank, but what's happening to our entire family. So.
After the judge came back, I could feel that it was not going our way. I was getting terrified in my seat, and as he's getting those words out, I'm like losing control of my breath, and I'm trying to keep calm, and I just couldn't. And at the end of it, he says, so with that in mind, I am finding Frank Bushauer guilty of first-degree homicide. My face just went numb. My entire face. I couldn't feel it as they take him out in cuffs. And, he's just mouthing the words, I love you. So. But I see the cash in the wallet, and I'm like, my dad needs this money. He needs stuff right away when he gets to Cook County. So I get through security, and I'm running through the hallway of the courthouse. And then I fall, or whatever, I drop it, and cards go flying everywhere, and I'm just like starting to cry there too. I'm just trying to get everything back into the wallet. My dad. All right.
Hello, this is a prepaid collect call from Inmate at Lamar Correctional Center. This call is subject to recording and monitoring. To accept charges, press 1. Hello, this is a prepaid collect call from an inmate at Lamar Correctional Center. This call is subject to recording and monitoring. To accept charges, press 1. Okay, good.
Hey, Dad, how you doing?
I'm doing okay. How about you?
He's not dead. He's still alive. We still get to talk to him. We still get to have him in our lives, albeit limited.
Sometimes I think it's harder for you guys than it is for me. I have no responsibilities. I don't clean the dishes. I don't cook. I sit around and read books.
Oh, have you gotten any more music on your tablet?
Well, I like a lot of the oldies, like Dolly Parton.
Yeah, well, hey, me too.
Johnny Cash. They sing a lot of gospel music, David.
Oh. Why is he sitting in a maximum security prison and I get to drive around. I get to go to the beach. I feel guilty for not being in prison. So I think we have to get wrapped up here soon. We're almost out of time, but just want to let you know that more than anything, I miss you.
Okay. Love you, later.
All right. Love you too, Dad. Have a good day.
The caller has hung up.
I'm very hard-pressed to figure out why such an innocent, gentle, kind man wound up on the wrong side of a murder investigation.
It's hard to accept that a family member killed somebody. It is. And that's the problem, is we always paint bad people and the boogeyman to look bad because it makes us feel better because we're alerting ourselves to them. Nobody knows how somebody is at home privately with somebody else in a relationship. And that's what happened here. Something exploded Frank Bushauer to cause him to place Cynthia under the water, hold her under the water until she was dead. And that's what we need to focus on. It's about justice for her.
I've prosecuted serial killers, serial rapists, gang leaders, true sociopaths. And Frank Bushauer does not fall into that category. Good people sometimes do horrible things. The bottom line is, he made that choice to end her life, and he did it when she was in the most vulnerable position possible, naked in a bathtub. And that's why, even if he never did anything else wrong in his life, that is why he has to be held responsible for what he did to her that night.
There wasn't any evidence, and there isn't any evidence. Because he's innocent, and I can't understand how anyone could think that he was a monster, a killer. I mean, he didn't kill her. I miss him every day. He's been such a part of my life. And now to have him in prison, I think about him when I drink coffee because he's not there having coffee with me. And now I know he's having instant crystals for coffee. This picture, my daughter for Christmas put on a coffee cup so I could have for coffee with my brother every morning. I miss him a lot.
Music was something that was truly mine.
Justice wasn't served today. Look who's got the price to pay. Justice wasn't served today. I guess we'll find another way.
Before, my dad was taking care of me, and now that he's been incarcerated, the roles have flipped, the roles have reversed, and I feel like I have to take care of him in taking forward the initiative for his freedom.
There's only one victim here, the boy whose dad they took away.
The rain in Atlanta doesn't wash away memories. It only seems to sharpen the edges of the ghosts that linger in the concrete veins of this city. It's 1991, a year etched into the bedrock of local lore, a time when the humid air hung heavy with more than just summer heat. It carried the metallic scent of secrets. Somewhere in the shadows of the metropolitan sprawl, a life was extinguished, leaving behind a silence so profound it still deafens those who dare to listen. This isn't just a file gathering dust in a basement archive. It is a living, breathing void, a cold case that mocked the badge and the uniform for decades. You feel at the moment you step into the precinct, the phantom weight of an unsolved crime, a shadow that refused to dissipate even as the neon lights of the city hummed through the years. The victim, a face lost to the blur of passing time, became a footnote in the ledger of the forgotten, while the perpetrator, a specter of pure malice, walked free, disappearing into the vast, indifferent tapestry of the urban landscape. The investigation began with the frantic, jagged static of a police radio slicing through the night, a call that would eventually haunt the dreams of every detective on the shift. When the first responders arrived, they weren't met with a crime. They were met with a landscape of ruin, a scene so precise in its brutality that it felt less like a struggle and more like a ritual. There were no grand theatrics, no cinematic flair, just the stark, clinical reality of a life cut short in the blink of an eye. The neighbors, those silent witnesses who saw nothing and heard everything, retreated behind locked doors, their eyes fixed on the flickering blue lights that bathed their porches in a surreal, ghostly hue. It was a cold case in the making, born from the initial shock that paralyzes a community and keeps the tongue from forming the truth. As the yellow tape was drawn taut across the threshold, the mystery was sealed, destined to be dissected by minds that would, for years, find nothing but dead ends and shattered leads. Evidence is a fickle ghost. It flickers in the peripheral vision and vanishes when you reach out to hold it. In the early days, the labs were a flurry of activity, with experts hunched over microscopes, hoping to pull a name from the microscopic debris of a struggle. They found fibers that told half a story, fingerprints that led to doors long since bricked over, and blood samples that, in 1991, lacked the narrative power of modern science. Each lead was a thread pulled from a sweater, enticing at first, but ultimately leaving the investigators with nothing but a tangled mess of broken promises. There was talk of a suspect, a man with a gaze as cold as the crime itself, seen hovering near the periphery of the victim's life. But in the frantic pace of an Atlanta summer, he slipped through the cracks, a shadow merging with the dark. The file grew thicker, the paper yellowing under the relentless fluorescent glare of the office, while the hope of a breakthrough began to wither, replaced by the hardening crust of cynicism that only a cold case can forge in the heart of a veteran detective. Year after year, the seasons turned, and the case shifted from a headline to a haunting. The community, once outraged, gradually learned to live with the specter in their midst, a silent pact of avoidance that kept the wound from ever truly closing. Every anniversary was a quiet reminder, a flickering candle in the window of a house that felt too empty, a question asked to the wind. Who did this? The investigators changed, the precinct shifted, and the city grew, steel and glass rising to bury the old secrets. Yet, the perpetrator remained a phantom, a cold-blooded architect of tragedy who had mastered the art of non-existence. They were a ghost in the machine, a name that could not be found, a face that could not be remembered, even by those who had once stared directly into the abyss of their eyes. It was a masterpiece of evasion, a crime so perfectly detached from the killer that the very idea of justice seemed like a cruel joke played by the universe. Technology is the patient hunter, a force that doesn't tire, doesn't blink, and eventually, inevitably, catches the scent. As the decades dragged on, the cold case was pulled from the depths of the archive, not by a person, but by the relentless march of forensic innovation. What was once invisible became illuminated. The stray skin cells left on a doorframe, the minute chemical trace on a piece of discarded clothing, were suddenly shouting a name that had been buried in the dark. It was like watching a grainy, black and white photograph slowly gain color, the features of the past sharpening into the terrifying reality of the present. The detectives, a new generation with the tools their predecessors could only dream of, began to stitch together the scattered fragments of a narrative that had been stalled for 35 years. The hunt wasn't just on. It was approaching its inevitable, explosive climax, turning the cold case into a ticking clock that was finally counting down to zero. The breakthrough, when it arrived, didn't come with the fanfare of a victory march. It came with the sudden, jarring precision of a digital match in a global database. A genetic marker, a sliver of DNA that had sat in a vial for more than 3 decades, finally found its home, unlocking a door that had been welded shut by time. The shock wave wasn't felt in the streets, but in the sterile, silent rooms where the past is decrypted. The name of the suspect, a man who had lived his life under the radar, suddenly burned on the screen, a beacon of malice in a digital sea. It was a moment of profound, chilling realization. The monster wasn't a myth, wasn't a legend of the city, but a man who had been eating, sleeping, and existing while the world turned around him. The evidence, once circumstantial and weak, was now a mountain of ironclad, immutable truth, a testament to the fact that while time may obscure the path, it never truly buries the sin. The arrest was a symphony of precision, a tactical strike launched in the dead of night to catch the shadow off guard. There were no dramatic standoffs, no cinematic chases, just the heavy tread of boots on a porch, the sharp knock of law enforcement, and the sudden, irreversible end of a decades-long anonymity. The man who had been a specter was suddenly a prisoner, stripped of his masks, his excuses, and the comfortable veneer of his long-hidden life. He was walked out in handcuffs, his face a mosaic of confusion and the dawning terror of a man who had realized that his past had finally caught up to his future. The community watched, breathless, as the history they had resigned themselves to, the tragedy they had accepted as an unsolvable mystery, was dismantled in a single, lightning-fast operation. It was the closing of a chapter that had been bleeding out since 1991. In the interrogation room, the silence was no longer heavy. It was absolute. The cold-blooded killer sat in the chair, a relic of a different era, confronted by the ghosts of their own making. The detectives didn't need to shout. They simply laid out the evidence, piece by piece, a mirror held up to a life of deception. Every word spoken, every piece of data presented, was a nail in the coffin of the secrecy that had sustained the perpetrator for so long. It was the unraveling of a facade, the messy, uncomfortable truth coming to light with a violence that made the original act seem almost distant. The killer, once so untouchable, was now a man caught in the spotlight, forced to look at the wreckage he had created. There was no glory in it, no sense of triumph, only the grim satisfaction of seeing the ledger balanced after a lifetime of waiting for the debt to be paid. The ripple effect of the arrest washed over the city like a tide, bringing with it a torrent of buried emotions. Families of the victim, who had spent decades wondering if they would die without knowing the truth, were suddenly thrust into a whirlwind of closure and trauma. The community, once haunted by the specter of the unsolved, now had to reckon with the reality of the known. It was a strange, disorienting sensation to have the mystery solved, yet to realize that the resolution didn't bring back what had been lost. The cold case had defined their lives for so long that its sudden disappearance left a vacuum, a space where the questions had been replaced by the brutal, unvarnished weight of the answer. It was a reminder that justice is not a cure. It is merely the final, necessary sting before the long process of healing can truly begin. As the court dates loomed and the trial began to take shape, the city of Atlanta found itself staring at its own reflection, looking at the cracks where a predator had slipped through. The case, once a symbol of the city's inability to protect its own, was now a beacon of its resilience. The legal machinery, fueled by the cold, hard facts of forensic science, began the process of formal condemnation. The killer, once a phantom, was now a defendant, reduced to the mundane reality of prison orange and fluorescent light. The story was moving toward its final, inevitable end, a process that felt as slow and grinding as the tectonic plates of the earth. But for the first time in 35 years, the story was linear, moving toward a destination that everyone could finally see, a conclusion that was carved in the bedrock of law and consequence. The legacy of the Atlanta 1991 cold case will not be the act itself, but the persistence of those who refused to let it stay buried. It is a testament to the truth that no secret, no matter how deeply interred, is safe from the relentless progression of time and the unyielding reach of justice. As the gavel falls and the final verdict is rendered, the ghost will finally be laid to rest, not in the shadows of the city, but in the history books of its past. The cycle is broken, the void is filled, and the community is left to move forward, scarred but intact. The case of 1991 is solved, but the memory of the search, the long, dark tunnel that finally found its light, will remain as a reminder that even in the coldest, darkest winter, there is always the potential for a dawn that refuses to be denied. The air in the squad room was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the hum of overworked machinery, a sensory anchor for a world that had forgotten the name of a killer. Decades had bled into one another, each year serving as a soft, suffocating layer of dust on the evidence boxes that sat like gravestones in the department's archive. This wasn't just a collection of paper, it was a testament to the sheer, stubborn audacity of a criminal who had gambled on the premise that time would act as an eraser. The 1991 Atlanta case was the crown jewel of that archive, a sprawling puzzle with missing pieces that seemed to have evaporated into the ether. Detectives who had first walked into that chaotic, blood-stained scene had long since retired, trading their badges for the quiet of suburban lawns and the slow burn of retirement, yet the ghost of the case remained a tether to their past. They would wake up at 3 a.m., the image of a discarded glove or a splintered doorframe flashing behind their eyelids, a silent, mocking reminder of the one that got away. It is a specific type of torture, this lingering uncertainty. It's not just the grief of the victim's family, who sat through birthdays and holidays with an empty chair that felt heavier every single year, but the professional laceration of the investigators. To lose a case to the shadows is to admit that in the grand cosmic balance, evil can occasionally claim a victory, can find a crack in the pavement and slip into the dark, untouchable and unchallenged. They had followed every lead, interviewed the neighbors until the questions became robotic, and checked the alibis until they were worn thin as parchment. But the perpetrator, this phantom who had left behind only the cold, clinical residue of their actions, was always one step ahead, moving through the city with the invisible confidence of a ghost. The city of Atlanta continued its relentless expansion, building up and out, burying the old streets under new steel, yet the case remained a static, unmoving point in the center of the chaos, a jagged shard of 1991 embedded in the heart of the present. The investigative process in those early years was a manual, agonizing grind. There was no instant access to international databases, no high-speed digital mapping of criminal patterns, only the slow, manual cross-referencing of handwritten reports and the gut instinct of seasoned veterans. They mapped the city with pins on a corkboard, tracing the potential flight paths of a killer who seemed to know the blind spots of every security camera, if such things even existed in the way they do now. They sat in darkened vehicles for days, listening to the city breathe, watching for the subtle shift in routine that might betray a guilty conscience. But the monster didn't have a routine. They had learned the art of disappearing into the crowd, of mimicking the rhythm of the law-abiding until they were indistinguishable from the background noise of life. The frustration was a physical weight, a pressure behind the eyes that never truly dissipated, turning every minor breakthrough into a mirage that evaporated as soon as they tried to reach for it. Then came the silence. The years where the phone stopped ringing, where the tips turned to static, and the file became a relic of a failed era. It is in this silence that the true cold case is forged. It isn't just the lack of evidence, it's the lack of hope, the creeping, insidious belief that the truth is permanently out of reach. The community, once reeling from the shock of the crime, slowly acclimated to the presence of the unsolved. It became a piece of folklore, a story parents told their children about the dangers that lurked in the city, a cautionary tale that stripped the victim of their humanity and turned them into a symbol. The tragedy was no longer a person. It was an abstract concept, a hole in the fabric of the neighborhood that everyone walked around, careful not to look down. This detachment was the killer's greatest shield. As long as the world viewed the crime as a historical event rather than a current reality, the trail would remain cold. Yet deep within the precinct, the file survived. It was passed from hand to hand, a rite of passage for every new detective who joined the unit. They would open the box, touch the brittle documents, and feel the cold, sharp gaze of the victim looking up from a faded photograph. It was an invitation to failure, a siren song that drew in the idealistic and spit them out, exhausted and humbled. The technology of the 90s, the limited DNA testing, the rudimentary fingerprint analysis, was like trying to map the ocean with a flashlight. Every time they thought they had a hit, the science would falter, or the trail would lead to a dead end, a man with a solid alibi, or a name that couldn't be linked to the physical scene. It was a game of cat and mouse where the mouse had long since left the maze, leaving the cat to pace the empty corridors of a building that had been demolished years ago. The evolution of forensic science, however, was about to change the fundamental nature of the hunt. It wasn't an overnight revolution, but a slow, tectonic shift in what was possible. Suddenly, the microscopic traces left behind, the forgotten hair, the drop of sweat on a discarded surface, the unseen transfer of skin cells, became eloquent witnesses. These were no longer just biological samples. They were digital signatures, keys that could unlock doors that had been slammed shut decades ago. The cold case detectives began to realize that the evidence wasn't dead. It was just sleeping, waiting for the technology to evolve enough to decipher the message it had been holding for them since 1991. They began to look at the evidence with fresh eyes, no longer constrained by the limitations of their predecessors, but energized by the potential of the new frontier. This is where the narrative shifts from pursuit to decryption. It's a process of translation, turning the raw, chaotic data of a 35-year-old crime scene into a cohesive, undeniable story. Every piece of clothing stored in the climate-controlled evidence locker was pulled out, re-examined, and subjected to processes that would have sounded like science fiction to the detectives of 1991. The atmosphere in the lab became one of hushed intensity, a temple to the truth where the only sound was the humming of the sequencers and the occasional, sharp intake of breath as a match, a definitive, absolute match, flashed across a monitor. The distance between the past and the present began to shrink, the gap bridged by the unerring logic of modern genetics. They weren't just searching for a killer anymore. They were mapping the trajectory of a life that had been hidden in plain sight, a life that was about to be laid bare for the world to see. The man they were looking for had gone to great lengths to insulate himself from the past. He had built a life out of mundane details, a wall of normalcy designed to deflect any scrutiny. He held jobs, paid his taxes, maintained relationships, and effectively scrubbed the memory of his former self from the public record. He was the neighbor who kept himself, the man you saw at the grocery store but never quite looked at, the invisible cog in the machine of urban life. He had mastered the art of being unremarkable, a trait that had served him better than any disguise could have. But he had made one mistake, or rather, he had been born with one immutable feature that he couldn't erase, a genetic fingerprint that he had unwittingly left at the scene of his sin, a permanent anchor to a night he thought he had completely outrun. As the detectives closed in, the dynamic of the case shifted from the cold, analytical work of the lab to the visceral, high-stakes intensity of the hunt. They began to build a profile of his current life, tracking his movements through the digital breadcrumbs we all leave behind. It was a strange, almost voyeuristic experience, watching the life of a killer unfold on a screen, seeing him go about his day, oblivious to the fact that his history was currently being exhumed by a team of people who had spent their entire careers preparing for this exact moment. The tension was palpable. Every day he remained free felt like an affront to the work they had done, a violation of the justice they were so close to exacting. They were no longer investigators. They were shadows of their own, mirroring his invisibility as they tightened the net around him. The planning for the final confrontation was done with the cold, surgical precision of a military operation. They knew his habits, his vulnerabilities, and the layout of his home. They knew that if he suspected anything, he wouldn't hesitate to disappear again, to slip into the next layer of the city and force them to start the cycle of pursuit all over again. The stakes were absolute. This wasn't just about an arrest. It was about the culmination of 3.5 decades of effort, the final move in a game that had started before some of the younger detectives were even born. They rehearsed the entry, the communication, the containment. Every variable was calculated. Every contingency was addressed. They were ready to bring the past crashing into the present. As they stood in the darkness outside his home, the air felt different, thicker, charged with the static of impending resolution. The city lights of Atlanta twinkled in the distance, a sprawling, indifferent observer to the drama about to unfold. The detectives felt the weight of the years, the faces of the victims, the frustration of the thousands of hours of work, all distilling down into these final, precious seconds. When they finally moved, they moved with a fluidity born of total commitment. There was no hesitation, no doubt, just the singular, driving force of justice, a long-awaited demand for payment on a debt that had been compounding for 35 years. The door opened, the light flooded in, and the shadow that had been hiding in the dark was finally forced into the blinding, unforgiving glare of reality. The case was over, the mystery was dismantled, and the ghost was finally, and forever, brought home to pay for what it had done. The transition from the shadow of anonymity to the glare of a holding cell is a violent, jarring process, a sudden stripping away of the life constructed on a foundation of lies. Inside the sterile, white-walled confines of the interrogation room, the silence was no longer merely an absence of noise. It was an active participant in the room. It was the silence of a man whose world had effectively ceased to exist the moment the handcuffs clicked shut. He sat there, a portrait of midlife banality, his hands folded on the metal table, his gaze fixed on a point in space that existed nowhere in that room. He was no longer the phantom of 1991, the predator who had stalked the night with a terrifying, calculated intent. He was simply a man, aged by the passage of time, confronted by the inescapable gravity of his own past. The detectives, seasoned veterans who had spent lifetimes reading the micro-expressions of the guilty and the terrified, watched him with a clinical detachment that was, in itself, a form of judgment. The interrogation began not with a roar, but with a whisper, a rhythmic, relentless laying out of the facts that had turned his life into a cage. They didn't need to ask if he had been there. They had the DNA, the irrefutable, scientific evidence that he had been standing exactly where the victim had fallen, breathing the same air as the tragedy unfolded. They spoke of the night in 1991, describing the scene with a level of detail that made the air in the room feel thin. Every sentence they uttered was a bridge between the present and that cold, forgotten night, forcing him to inhabit the space of his crime all over again. He watched them with a mix of defiance and resignation, his jaw tight, his pulse a frantic, unseen rhythm beneath the skin of his throat. He had spent 35 years telling himself that the secret was safe, that he had successfully compartmentalized his humanity, but he hadn't accounted for the relentless, exponential growth of technology that would eventually turn his own biology into a witness against him. As the hours stretched into the night, the facade began to crack. It wasn't a total collapse. The sociopathic core remained intact, but the structural integrity of his denial was failing. They showed him the photos, the ones that had been buried in the files for decades, and he looked at them as if they were maps to a country he had long since exiled himself from. The detectives pressed on, digging into the minutiae of his life in the years that followed, peeling back the layers of the false identity he had curated so carefully. They wanted to know why, the question that is always at the heart of the cold case, the void that never truly fills. He remained largely mute, a stone in a stream, but his silence was becoming heavy with the weight of the inevitable. He understood, with the clarity of a trapped animal, that there was no way out. The trap hadn't just been set, it had been sprung, and the jaws were tight. Outside the walls of the precinct, the news had begun to ripple through the city. a shockwave that hit the community with the force of a sudden storm. People who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, who remembered the fear that had gripped the streets back in the early 90s, were suddenly forced to reckon with the reality that the monster hadn't lived in their nightmares. He had lived next door. The revelation was deeply unsettling, a profound violation of the collective trust that binds a community together. Neighbors looked at each other with a new, guarded suspicion, wondering who else among them might be carrying a secret of similar gravity. The arrest of the 1991 Phantom had transformed the abstract terror of the past into a concrete, modern anxiety. It was as if the city had been holding its breath for 35 years, and now, finally, it was being forced to exhale, the air tainted with the bitterness of long-suppressed trauma. The victim's family, who had spent decades living in the shadow of the unknown, were now forced into the light of a brutal, cold clarity. For them, the arrest was not a clean ending. It was an aperture opening onto a landscape of grief they had been denied the right to fully explore for a generation. Every update from the police, every detail revealed in the press, was like a fresh laceration. They had mourned a ghost for 35 years, and now they had to confront the flesh-and-blood reality of the man who had stolen their future. The closure they had sought for so long was a double-edged sword. It gave them the truth, but it also robbed them of the possibility that the truth might have been different, might have been less cruel. They were navigating a sea of complex, conflicting emotions, struggling to reconcile the long-festering anger of the cold case with the sudden, sharp reality of the prosecution. The detectives, meanwhile, were moving through the final stages of the process, their work shifting from the active pursuit of evidence to the rigorous, methodical preparation of a trial. They were compiling the narrative of the crime, turning the disjointed fragments of a 35-year-old investigation into a coherent, compelling argument for justice. It was a painstaking, exhaustive process, one that required them to reach back through the decades, contacting old witnesses who had long since moved on, tracking down documents that had been filed away in long-forgotten basements, and synthesizing a mountain of forensic data that was, in 1991, non-existent. They were building a monument to the truth, a case so comprehensive and so ironclad that the defense would have no room to maneuver. It was the final, critical push, the culmination of everything they had worked for, and they were not going to let a single detail slip through the cracks. The atmosphere in the city grew increasingly charged as the date for the preliminary hearings approached. There was a sense of collective catharsis, a feeling that a debt long overdue was finally being collected. The media covered the case with a frenzied intensity, digging into every aspect of the killer's life, transforming him from a quiet, unremarkable neighbor into a cautionary tale about the banality of evil. They interviewed psychologists, former colleagues, and distant acquaintances, all of whom struggled to reconcile the image of the man they knew with the reality of the crime he had committed. It was a fascinating, albeit dark, study in human behavior, how a predator can walk among the prey for years, unrecognized, their malice hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy that was as convincing as it was artificial. As the legal proceedings moved forward, the city of Atlanta became a theater for the resolution of the past. The courtroom was packed with those who had been touched by the case, the family members, the former detectives, the journalists who had cut their teeth on the initial reports. It was a somber, intensely emotional environment, a space where the heavy weight of the past was being weighed against the cold, impartial scales of the law. The killer sat in the center of it all, a silent, increasingly isolated figure, his presence a stark reminder of the wreckage that had been left behind. He was a man out of time, a relic of a different era, who was now being judged by the standards of a world he no longer understood. The trial was the final act in the tragedy that had begun on that fateful night in 1991, the place where the silence was finally and definitively broken. Throughout the trial, the prosecution laid out the case with a surgical focus that left little to the imagination. They presented the evidence as a series of indisputable facts, weaving together the forensic data, the circumstantial evidence, and the testimony of those who had lived through the aftermath of the crime. It was a masterclass in legal strategy, a relentless, step-by-step destruction of any potential narrative of innocence. The killer's defense was weak, desperate, and ultimately ineffective against the sheer volume of evidence that had been accumulated. He was a man who had no story left to tell, no defense that could survive the scrutiny of the truth. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the outcome was never really in doubt. The only question was the depth and the duration of the justice that would be served. The climax of the trial came not with a dramatic revelation, but with the quiet, devastating announcement of the verdict. It was the moment the entire community had been waiting for, the release of the pressure that had been building since the day of the arrest. When the jury returned their decision, the room fell into a silence so profound it felt like the very air had stopped moving. The verdict was guilty, a word that resonated through the room like a hammer blow. It was the end of the mystery, the conclusion of the cold case, the moment when the ghost was finally laid to rest. The family of the victim wept, the detectives exchanged looks of quiet, exhausted relief, and the killer, for the first time, seemed to fully comprehend the permanence of his situation. He was a man whose past had finally, irrevocably caught up to him, a debt that would be paid in the currency of his freedom for the rest of his natural life. In the aftermath, the city began the slow process of returning to a semblance of normal. The headline that had dominated the news for weeks began to fade, replaced by the mundane, ever-changing rhythm of urban life. The case was no longer a cold case. It was a solved case, a part of the city's history that had been resolved and filed away. But for those who had been closest to it, for the families and the investigators, the memory would never truly fade. It remained a part of their identity, a chapter in their lives that would always be defined by the search for the truth. They had lived through the darkness and come out the other side, and they had done so by refusing to let the ghost win. They had held on to the hope of justice, even when it seemed like a futile, impossible dream, and their persistence had been rewarded in the only way that mattered, by ensuring that the truth, no matter how long it took to uncover, was ultimately revealed. The verdict didn't just signal the end of a trial. It ripped a jagged hole through the thin veil of normalcy the killer had spent 3 decades weaving around himself. With the gavel's final, resounding echo, the courtroom felt less like a hall of justice and more like a crypt being pried open. For the man sitting at the defense table, the world had fundamentally shifted from a sphere of comfortable concealment to a tightening box of inescapable truth. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the gallery, the weeping relatives, the steely-eyed detectives, the bored court reporters, and for the first time, he seemed to grasp that he was no longer a human being with a history. He was now an object, a completed puzzle, a case file that had been successfully closed. The terror he had inflicted in 1991 had finally boomeranged, returning with the compounding interest of 35 years of societal evolution, catching him not in a moment of violence, but in the slow, grinding machinery of institutional accountability. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was thick with a strange, disorienting sensation of victory. It wasn't the kind of victory you celebrate with cheers or backslapping. It was a heavy, somber relief, the kind that settles in the bones after a long, grueling endurance test. The lead detective stood in the break room, the same space where so many cups of coffee had been consumed while staring at that same, persistent, yellowing file. The box of evidence, now processed and archived for trial, sat on a nearby desk, its contents no longer a mystery, but a narrative of destruction. They had been haunted by this case for so long that it had become a phantom limb. Now that it was removed, they felt a phantom ache where the burden used to be. It was the realization that their primary purpose, the reason they had pulled those extra shifts and lost those nights of sleep, had been fulfilled, and the transition into a post-case reality was proving to be a psychological challenge all its own. As the word spread through the ranks of the department, a quiet reverence settled over the halls. The story of the Atlanta 1991 case had become a mythic entity within the force, a cautionary tale about the limits of human perseverance and the eventual triumph of technology over the passage of time. Younger officers, who had been toddlers when the crime was committed, looked at the veteran investigators with a new level of respect. They were the ones who had kept the light on, who had refused to let the darkness of that year consume the memory of the victim. It served as a vital lesson for the next generation. that no matter how cold the trail, no matter how distant the memory, there is always a potential for the truth to reemerge. The case had become the department's institutional compass, proving that the badge is not merely a tool of enforcement, but a guardian of the truth that transcends the calendar. Outside, in the sprawling, humid streets of Atlanta, the city itself seemed to be processing the resolution in its own way. The neighborhood where the crime had occurred, a place that had been marked by the silence of the unsolved, was beginning to shed its heavy, oppressive skin. Neighbors who had whispered about the mystery house or the unsolved tragedy were now forced to confront the reality of the man who had been the architect of their unease. It prompted a wave of community introspection. How many other secrets were hidden behind the closed doors and manicured lawns of their suburbs? The comfort of anonymity was replaced by a sharper, more alert sense of vigilance. People started talking to their neighbors, really talking, breaking down the artificial barriers of urban isolation. The cold case, in its final resolution, had inadvertently sparked a social renewal, a recognition that justice is not something that happens only in courtrooms, but something that is maintained by the awareness and cohesion of the community itself. The media, which had spent weeks feasting on the grisly details of the conviction, shifted its gaze toward the broader implications of the case. Documentaries were pitched, investigative long reads were drafted, and the narrative of the Atlanta 1991 cold case became a staple of true crime discourse. But for those who knew the case in its raw, unfiltered state, the public's obsession felt reductive. They saw the human cost, the decades of stunted lives and unresolved grief that could never be rectified by a prison sentence. The media portrayed it as a slick, high-tech victory, but the reality was far messier, a long, soul-crushing slog through the grit of human malice and the slow, inevitable creep of progress. The true story wasn't the forensic match that cracked the case. It was the sheer, stubborn, irrational refusal of a few people to let a fellow human being be forgotten. Deep in the detention center, the killer was settling into a new, terrifying routine. The isolation was absolute. He was a man who had lived in the shadow for 35 years, and now he was forced into the ultimate shadow, the monochromatic, regulated environment of maximum security. Every hour was accounted for, every movement restricted, every interaction mediated by glass and steel. He was no longer a person of agency. He was a statistic, a ward of the state whose only remaining function was to serve as a cautionary vessel for the consequences of his actions. He often sat in his cell, staring at the concrete, replaying the events of 1991 not as a ghost, but as a condemned man. The power he once felt, the intoxicating sense of superiority that comes from outsmarting the world, had been stripped away, replaced by the crushing realization that he had always been a prisoner. He had simply been oblivious to the walls until the moment they closed in. The victim's family, meanwhile, had begun the delicate process of mourning in the wake of closure. For years, their grief had been frozen, trapped in the amber of the unknown. They had been unable to find closure because there was no closure to find, only the endless, agonizing wait for a breakthrough that seemed to recede further into the horizon with every passing year. Now, they were in the middle of a thaw. The pain was still there, sharp and visceral, but it had a different texture now. It was no longer a frantic search for answers. It was a settled, heavy reality that they could finally begin to work through. They visited the site of the crime, not as a place of terror, but as a place of finality. They laid flowers on the ground that had once held the secrets of the killer, and for the first time in 35 years, they didn't feel the weight of the unanswered question pulling at their hearts. The investigators kept the case file on their desks for a few weeks after the sentencing, a final symbolic gesture before it was officially boxed up and sent to the long-term storage facility. It felt like a parting with an old, difficult friend. They had come to know the victim through the evidence, the favorite books, the coffee mugs, the letters, the trivial debris of a life interrupted. They had protected this memory with the same ferocity they would have protected a living person. As they finally taped the box shut, there was a sense of profound professional closure. The task was done. The cycle was complete. The city of Atlanta moved on, the sun rose and set on a world that was slightly more balanced, slightly more just. But the history of the case would remain, a permanent part of the city's consciousness, a chilling reminder of the evil that once walked its streets and the unyielding determination that eventually, inevitably, brought it into the light. The conviction had stripped the case of its mystery, but it had left behind a lingering, radioactive residue of questions that no courtroom could ever truly settle. While the legal machinery had ground the killer into submission, the community of Atlanta was left to grapple with the haunting reality of his double life. He hadn't lived in a subterranean lair or a remote cabin. He had lived in the suburbs, mowed his lawn on Saturday mornings, chatted with neighbors about the weather, and worked a steady, unremarkable job. This was the true, chilling revelation that kept people awake at night. The realization that the face of absolute evil is often the face of the man who holds the door open for you at the supermarket. The investigation had solved the what, the how, and the who, but it had fundamentally failed to answer the why, and that absence of motive felt, in many ways, like a final, mocking victory for the perpetrator. In the precinct, the quiet that followed the conclusion of the trial was heavy, almost suffocating. The detectives who had spent years, some their entire careers, married to this file now found themselves in a state of existential displacement. They had to find themselves by the hunt, by the frustration, by the intellectual battle against an elusive ghost. With the hunt finished, they felt an unsettling drift. One by one, they would return to the office late at night, not to work, but to sit in the stillness, surrounded by the ghosts of other cases, pondering the strange, fragile nature of human history. They were realizing that justice is not a static object you acquire. It is a fleeting, ephemeral state that requires constant, exhausting effort to maintain. The Atlanta 1991 case had taught them that even if you catch the monster, you can never truly undo the damage they cause to the fabric of reality. The media narrative, initially obsessed with the triumph of DNA technology, began to pivot toward the human interest stories that usually follow such a monumental collapse of a secret. Reporters were scouring the neighborhood, looking for the person who knew him best, trying to find some sign, some subtle aberration in his behavior that could have tipped them off. It was a futile, exhausting exercise. Every neighbor recalled him as quiet, polite, or reserved, the very qualities that had allowed him to blend into the scenery. It was a terrifying reminder of how little we truly know the people who surround us. The public's anxiety wasn't just about the crime that was solved. It was about the potential for other crimes, other secrets, festering in the dark corners of the city that remained untouched and undiscovered. The case had not provided a sense of safety. It had provided a map of our own profound vulnerability. Deep within the prison system, the killer was experiencing his own version of this existential reckoning. Without the constant effort of maintaining his facade, without the daily task of navigating the world as a normal, functioning citizen, he was forced into a state of total self-confrontation. For 35 years, his identity had been a performative act, a masterfully crafted lie that he told to the world and, in many ways, to himself. Now, stripped of his props, his stage, and his audience, he was forced to inhabit the raw, unadorned truth of his own malice. He spent his days in a cell that was an exact, sterile copy of his own internal void. He wasn't a legend, a criminal mastermind, or a figure of intrigue. He was simply a small, angry man who had destroyed a life for reasons that were as petty and insignificant as his existence now was. It was the ultimate irony. The predator had spent his life trying to be invisible, and in his final, permanent incarceration, he had finally succeeded. The victim's family had reached a different, more complicated stage of their journey. They had achieved the objective. They knew the name of the one who had taken their loved one. They had seen him shackled, heard the verdict, and watched him disappear into the maw of the penal system. But they found that the satisfaction they had expected was an elusive, shifting target. They had lived for 3 decades in a state of hypervigilance, and that instinct didn't just switch off because a judge signed a piece of paper. They were still catching themselves looking over their shoulders, still feeling that sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline when a stranger looked at them for a fraction of a second too long. They were beginning to understand that the cold case hadn't just been a trial to endure. It had been a crucible that had fundamentally reshaped their nervous systems. They weren't just grieving a loss anymore. They were grieving the 35 years of potential that had been stolen alongside the life itself. As the months rolled on, the city began to reclaim the narrative of the case, turning it into a textbook example of justice served. Universities invited the detectives to give guest lectures on the intersection of forensic science and police work. The case became a case study in investigative persistence. It was the sanitized, respectable version of the story, the one that made people feel better about the world. But for those who had been in the thick of it, the lab techs, the field agents, the victims' closest friends, the reality was still raw, still filled with the jagged, unpleasant edges of the truth. They knew that the technology had only worked because they had been lucky enough to hold on to the right piece of evidence, that it was a gamble as much as it was a science. They lived with the knowledge that thousands of other cases, just as tragic and just as important, were currently sitting in boxes in other cities, waiting for a break in the luck that might never come. The archive, once filled with the visceral, living documents of the 1991 crime, was now a place of silent, dusty finality. The file had been moved from the active/ongoing section to the resolved section, a small, bureaucratic change that represented the end of a multi-decade epoch. It was a strange, hollow feeling for the records clerk who performed the task. She felt as though she were filing away a piece of her own youth, a memory that had been a constant, low-level hum in the background of her working life. She ran her hand over the binding of the final report, feeling the weight of the thousands of hours, the millions of words, and the immeasurable amount of human suffering that had been condensed into those few hundred pages. She closed the drawer, the sound echoing in the quiet room, and walked away, leaving the ghost of the Atlanta 1991 cold case to finally and properly rest in the annals of history. But even as the city moved on, the legacy of the case continued to ripple in the quiet, private corners of people's lives. It served as a reminder that the past is never truly dead. It is just waiting for the right tool, the right moment, or the right person to drag it back into the present. Every time a new missing person report was filed, every time a new case went cold, the story of 1991 was whispered in the corridors of the precinct. It was the standard to which all other cases were held, the beacon of hope that kept them going when the evidence was thin and the leads were non-existent. The killer might be in a cell, and the case might be solved, but the detective work continued, an endless, cyclical battle against the darkness. The case of 1991 was no longer a mystery to be solved, but a piece of armor to be worn, a reminder that no matter how long the shadow, the light of truth is always just one breakthrough away from breaking it apart forever. The resolution of the Atlanta 1991 cold case didn't just close a file. It fundamentally altered the gravitational pull of the entire department. For 35 years, the unresolved nature of that crime had acted as a psychic anchor, a constant drag on the morale of the homicide unit. Every detective who walked through those doors knew the story. It was the ghost in the machine, the case that proved how easily justice could slip through the cracks of a flawed system. Now that the anchor had been lifted, the atmosphere in the squad room felt strangely buoyant, yet underscored by a profound, lingering melancholy. They had won, but the victory was a reminder of the sheer, agonizing duration required to extract the truth. The younger generation of investigators, who had grown up in a world of high-speed digital surveillance and instant forensic feedback, found it difficult to fathom the patience of their predecessors, who had waited decades for a piece of data to align. It was in this post-resolution period that the deeper, more unsettling questions began to take root. If this monster had been hidden in plain sight for 3.5 decades, how many other predators were currently blending into the fabric of the city? The detectives began to look at their current caseloads with a heightened, almost neurotic level of scrutiny. They weren't just looking for clues anymore. They were looking for the patterns of invisibility. They were studying the mundane habits of suspects, looking for the tiny, almost imperceptible cracks in their projected normality. The 1991 case had become the lens through which they viewed every new threat, a brutal masterclass in the art of human deception. They realized that the killer hadn't been a genius. He had been a master of the mundane, a man who understood that if you never drew attention to yourself, the spotlight would never find you. The community, for its part, was struggling to maintain its newfound sense of vigilance. In the initial wake of the arrest, there was a surge of neighborly interaction, an attempt to bridge the gaps that had allowed such a crime to fester. But as the months passed, the inevitable drift toward urban isolation began to take hold once again. The tragedy was no longer the centerpiece of the local conversation, and the protective walls of privacy began to rise back up, brick by brick. This was the most difficult reality for the investigators to witness, the tendency of the world to move on, to forget, to prioritize comfort over the uncomfortable awareness of the dark. They saw the neighborhood returning to its old patterns, the mystery house being sold to new residents who knew nothing of its history, and they felt a flicker of the old, familiar frustration. They knew that memory is the only true defense against the recurrence of the past, and memory is a fragile thing. Deep within the state prison system, the killer was descending into the silence of his own making. He had become a ghost in a different kind of architecture, one that was designed to ensure that he would never again influence the outside world. He spent his days in the rigid, repetitive motion of incarceration, a life stripped of all nuance and complexity. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was with the detached, flat tone of a man who had long ago severed his connection to his own humanity. He was a cautionary exhibit, a man who had traded his soul for an invisible life and, in the end, had lost everything. The guards and the other inmates looked at him with a mix of fear and disdain, sensing the cold, static vacancy that he radiated. He was the embodiment of the cold in Cold Case, a chilling, hollowed-out shell that was finally where it belonged, locked away from the world he had once manipulated with such terrifying, quiet ease. The victim's family had reached a place of quiet, exhausted equilibrium. They were no longer the face of the tragedy, no longer the people who were constantly sought out by reporters or investigators. They had retreated into the sanctity of their private lives, trying to rebuild the structures that had been shattered in 1991. They were the true heroes of the story, the ones who had held on to the memory of their loved one when the rest of the world had moved on. They had faced the monster in court, looked him in the eye, and watched him be taken away. That was the closure they had been denied for so long, and it was, in the end, a profound, if painful, gift. They were the ones who carried the weight of the years, the ones who had been forged by the fire of the unknown, and they were the ones who would finally be allowed to mourn in the silence of their own hearts. Meanwhile, the city of Atlanta was undergoing its own metamorphosis, expanding and renovating at a pace that threatened to swallow the past entirely. New skyscrapers rose on the horizons, and old neighborhoods were being gentrified, the physical traces of the 1991 era being polished away by the relentless drive of progress. The investigators would drive through these areas and feel a strange sense of displacement. They remembered the city as it was, the grime, the shadows, the silence, and they felt the disconnect between the vibrant, modern city and the dark, static past they had spent so much of their lives excavating. It was a reminder that time is not just a healer, it is a destroyer, an eraser of the physical markers of our history. They were the keepers of the memory, the ones who had to ensure that the lesson was not lost in the glitz and the steel of the new city. The case file itself was now a piece of permanent history. It had been moved to the municipal archives, a dusty, quiet room where the past was organized and indexed for the benefit of future generations. It was no longer a tool of the living. It was a record of the dead. For the detectives who had closed it, visiting the archives was a strange, pilgrimage-like experience. They would find the box, sit at a table in the dim light, and look through the pages one last time. They would see the names of people who were long gone, the faces of witnesses who had passed away, and the signatures of investigators who had retired to other lives. It was a testament to the passage of time, a humbling reminder that they were all just passing through, performing their part in the endless, unfolding narrative of the city. The legacy of the Atlanta 1991 case had become a permanent part of the police department's training curriculum. It was used to teach the necessity of preserving evidence, the value of interagency cooperation, and the crucial importance of never giving up on a victim, no matter how much time had passed. The instructors would point to the 1991 file as the gold standard of resilience. They would explain to the recruits that the badge they wore was not just a symbol of authority, but a promise to the victims and their families. That promise, they would tell them, is the only thing that separates us from the chaos of the night. The 1991 case was the bridge between the old way of doing things and the new, the point where human intuition and cold, calculated science met to produce a result that, for a long time, seemed entirely impossible. As the years continue to turn, the story of the Atlanta 1991 case will likely evolve from a news report to a local legend, a tale told to new residents about the time the city's most elusive ghost was finally caught. It will become a part of the city's fabric, a thread in the complex, often dark tapestry of its development. But for those who are directly involved, it will always be something else. It will be a defining chapter in the long, often difficult journey toward justice. They will remember the frustration, the long nights, the moments of despair, and the final, blinding flash of resolution. They will remember the victim, whose life was taken for no reason, and they will know that they had, in their own way, honored that life by refusing to let it disappear into the void. They had performed the ultimate service. They had brought the truth out of the dark and into the light, and in doing so, they had brought peace to a city that had been waiting for it for a very long time. And finally, the silence of the city itself returned to a state of normalcy. The streets, the buildings, and the people all continued their rhythm, oblivious to the fact that a profound debt had been paid. The shadow that had hung over the neighborhood was gone, replaced by the mundane, flickering lights of the modern world. It was as it should be. A case is solved, a killer is caught, and the world turns. But for a few, for those who were there when the light was first dimmed, the memory of that 1991 night will always be a reminder of the fragility of peace and the terrible, beautiful necessity of the search for truth. They had walked through the dark, they had faced the ghost, and they had come out the other side, changed forever by the experience, yet stronger for it. The case was closed, the story was finished, and the city was finally quiet again. The resolution of the Atlanta 1991 cold case had become a cornerstone of local history, yet for the veteran detectives who had navigated its labyrinthine depths, it remained a phantom that refused to fully vacate their minds. The physical evidence was long since processed, the court transcripts bound and archived, and the perpetrator firmly entrenched in the bleak monotony of maximum security. Yet, the psychological landscape remained scarred. They would find themselves in the quiet hours of the morning, when the city was still held in the grip of pre-dawn stillness, reflecting on the sheer, fragile alignment of circumstances that had finally brought the killer to heel. It wasn't just the forensic breakthrough, it was the confluence of persistent human effort, the slow advancement of technology, and the stubborn refusal of the victim's memory to be erased by the relentless march of time. This intersection, they realized, was the only place where true justice could be forged in an indifferent world. In the precinct, the younger officers were beginning to view the case as an abstract lesson, a foundational narrative of professional persistence. But for the veterans, it was a visceral map of their own growth and the evolution of the city itself. They remembered the Atlanta of 1991, a city that felt larger, more disconnected, and significantly more dangerous because of its secrets. The transition to the present, where every street corner was monitored and every digital footprint was trackable, felt like living in a different reality. The 1991 case was the bridge between these two worlds, a final, lingering echo of a time when a predator could successfully melt into the crowd, leaving nothing but an unsolved tragedy in their wake. They were the bridge keepers, the ones who had witnessed the shift from the age of shadows to the age of digital transparency, and they felt a profound, heavy responsibility for the secrets they had helped pull into the light. The neighborhood where the crime had once cast its long, dark shadow had, over the years, undergone a dramatic transformation. What was once a place of whispered rumors and locked doors had become a vibrant, modern enclave. The old, weathered homes replaced by sleek, modern structures that held no memory of the past. The investigators would drive through these streets on their way home, searching for the physical remnants of their former struggle, a doorway, a tree, a specific patch of sidewalk, but most of it was gone, overwritten by the aggressive, relentless progress of urban development. This erasure was, in some ways, a relief, a literal washing away of the trauma that had haunted the community for so long. Yet it was also a source of melancholy, a reminder that the world is a relentless moving force, prone to forgetting even the most significant chapters of its own history. Deep within the penal institution, the killer, the architect of the 1991 nightmare, was becoming a static, forgotten entity. He was a man out of time, a ghost inhabiting a space that had no room for his past narratives. His attempts to justify or reframe his actions were met with the wall of reality that he himself had helped build. He was now just one of many, a prisoner defined by his conviction rather than his character. The guards and administrators observed him with a studied, detached indifference. He was no longer a person of interest, no longer the subject of a high-profile, nation-spanning manhunt. He was simply a number, a logistical concern in the vast, bureaucratic machinery of the state. It was the ultimate, final punishment, the total stripping away of the relevance he had clung to for 35 years, leaving him with nothing but the crushing, empty reality of his own choices. The victim's family had moved toward a state of profound, quiet endurance. They were no longer the figures of public interest they had been in the immediate aftermath of the arrest, which was, for them, a welcome liberation. They had reclaimed the ability to grieve in private, to hold the memory of their loved one without the intrusion of the media or the weight of the investigation. They were the ones who had sustained the most profound loss, and their ability to emerge from the other side of that 35-year ordeal with their humanity intact was, in the eyes of the investigators, the most impressive feat of the entire case. They had learned to live in a world where the truth was known, a world where the void had been filled with the cold, hard reality of the perpetrator's fate. It was a victory, but a victory that had been paid for in the most expensive currency imaginable: time, grief, and the irrecoverable years of a life interrupted. Meanwhile, the broader societal discourse around the case began to shift, moving from the specific horror of the crime to the broader, more complex issues of how we handle the cold in cold cases. It became a benchmark for policy discussions on cold case funding, the importance of maintaining evidence integrity, and the necessity of leveraging interdisciplinary teams to tackle long-term investigations. The Atlanta case was the gold standard, the success story that policymakers pointed to when arguing for the resources needed to keep the cold cases of the past from falling into oblivion. It was an institutional legacy that extended far beyond the walls of the Atlanta precinct, shaping the way that law enforcement agencies across the country approached the daunting, seemingly impossible task of revisiting the unresolved tragedies of the previous century. For the laboratory technicians who had played such a critical, behind-the-scenes role, the case remained a masterpiece of analytical rigor. They had spent years refining the techniques that had finally cracked the DNA match, moving from the early, primitive methods to the precise, molecular-level precision of the present. They saw the case as a validation of their discipline, a proof that the patience of the scientist is just as important as the tenacity of the detective. They lived for the moments when the data finally spoke, when the chaos of a decades-old scene resolved into a single, undeniable conclusion. They had seen the case through its darkest, most uncertain phases, and their commitment to the integrity of the samples had been the thin line between failure and justice. They were the quiet architects of the resolution, the ones who had translated the language of the past into the certainty of the present. As the years continue to accumulate, the case will eventually fade from the public consciousness, becoming nothing more than a historical record in a digital database. But the impact it had on the people involved, the detectives, the families, the community, and even the killer himself, will remain as a permanent part of their inner lives. It was an encounter with the limits of human knowledge and the resilience of human hope, a reminder that the truth is a persistent, gravitational force that eventually pulls everything into its orbit. The investigators knew that while this specific ghost had been laid to rest, the work of the department was far from over. There were other boxes in the archive, other stories trapped in the dark, and other families waiting for the same, long-overdue phone call. The 1991 case was the guidepost for all that was to come, a testament to the fact that no matter how long the wait, the truth is always worth the cost of the search. The silence that now permeates the precinct is not the heavy, oppressive silence of the past, but the active, vigilant silence of a unit that knows the value of its work. They continue to track, to analyze, and to push forward, driven by the knowledge that every case they resolve is a small, necessary correction to the injustice of the world. They carry the lessons of 1991 with them like a secondary badge, a reminder that the badge is not just a symbol of power, but a commitment to the preservation of the truth against the eroding forces of time. The case is solved, the mystery is over, and the victim is remembered, not as a symbol, but as a person, a life that was cut short, but whose story was, at the very end, honored by those who refused to let it slip away. It is the final, ultimate conclusion to the Atlanta 1991 saga. The story is no longer a cold case. It is a testament to the enduring, unyielding power of justice. The finality of a closed case is often described as a moment of peace, but for the investigators who had spent decades in the trenches of the 1991 Atlanta saga, it felt more like the quiet that follows a massive, earth-shaking detonation. The rubble was cleared, the landscape of their professional lives had been permanently altered, and the crater left by the investigation was now a part of the city's geography. They walked the halls of the precinct with a different cadence. They were no longer the frantic, chasing shadows of the 90s. They were the architects of a resolution that had been decades in the making. The air in the squad room was no longer heavy with the static of an unresolved, festering secret. Instead, it was filled with the rhythmic, steady hum of a department that had successfully looked into the abyss and, against all odds, managed to pull a truth back out with them. Yet, this resolution was never going to be a simple, clean-cut triumph. The case had become so deeply woven into the fabric of their lives that its removal left a structural void. They found themselves, in the quiet moments of their downtime, still mentally filing evidence, still rereading the transcripts of witness testimonies, still looking for the what-if that had dominated their early careers. It was a form of psychological residue, a habit of mind that was difficult to break after 35 years of constant, low-level vigilance. They had to teach themselves to exist in a world where the case was no longer the primary motivator of their existence. It was a process of decompression, a slow, often uncomfortable shedding of the skin of their former, obsessive selves. They were learning to be people again, rather than just vessels for an ongoing, all-consuming mystery. The victim's family, too, found themselves navigating a strange, unmapped territory. For 3.5 decades, their identities had been partially formed by the status of their quest. They were the ones waiting for an answer, the ones holding out for the truth. Now that they had the answer, they had to redefine themselves in the absence of that central, agonizing pursuit. It was a liberation, but one that came with the melancholy weight of finality. They had closure, yes, but closure is not the same as healing. It is merely the point where the wound stops being a constant, open bleeding and starts to become a scar. They visited the site of the loss, not with the frantic, pleading energy of the past, but with a quiet, reflective stillness that felt, in its own way, like a final goodbye. They had done their part, held the line, and survived the long, dark winter of their wait. In the broader community, the case had transitioned from a news headline to a part of the local mythology. People would speak of the 1991 breakthrough as a landmark moment in the city's growth, a turning point where science and tenacity had finally aligned to conquer the darkness. Newcomers to Atlanta would hear the story with a sense of wonder, unable to fully grasp the depth of the fear that had once gripped the streets. The investigators watched this transition with a mix of satisfaction and detachment. They knew that the myth was a sanitized, simplified version of the reality, that the actual process of solving the case had been ugly, exhausting, and filled with failures that the public would never see. But they accepted the myth. It served a purpose. It provided the community with a sense of order, a belief that even in the most chaotic, inexplicable circumstances, there is an eventual, inevitable path to the truth. The killer, meanwhile, had reached the final, absolute destination of his life's trajectory. Within the confines of the penitentiary, He had become an invisible man among invisible men. The irony was total. After spending his life trying to remain unseen, he had succeeded, but in a way that offered him no agency, no pride, and no reflection of his former, manufactured self. He was a non-entity, a cog in a system that cared nothing for his history, his reasons, or his remaining days. The guards, hardened by years of exposure to the worst of humanity, looked at him with an indifference that was more devastating than hatred. He had been reduced to a serial number and a set of institutional protocols. He had finally found the perfect hiding spot, and it was the very thing he had spent 35 years trying to avoid, a place where he no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The laboratory teams, those unsung heroes of the modern forensic era, found themselves looking back at the 1991 case as a foundational study in the power of potential. They had seen the progression of their field, from the early days of basic chemical analysis to the sophisticated, high-resolution genetic mapping that had finally pinned the killer to the scene. It was a career-defining journey. They knew that the case was the perfect advertisement for the necessity of funding forensic research, for the importance of holding on to cold evidence, and for the value of believing that no trace is ever truly meaningless. They had transformed the science of the past into the certainty of the present, and in doing so, they had given the department a permanent, unshakable confidence in their ability to solve the impossible. As the months turned into years, the city of Atlanta continued to race ahead, its skyline changing, its population swelling, and its priorities shifting toward the demands of the future. The 1991 case, which had once felt like the most important event in the world, began to recede into the backdrop, a historical detail that would soon be forgotten by all but a handful of people. And that, the investigators realized, was the final stage of justice. It wasn't about fame or headlines or even the satisfaction of a job well done. It was about returning the world to a state of normalcy where a crime like the one in 1991 was no longer a constant, looming threat, but a remembered, resolved, and contextualized tragedy. They had played their part in that return, and they could finally and truly stand back and let the city continue its inevitable, rhythmic motion. The file, now securely tucked away in the deepest archives of the municipal repository, was a testament to the fact that nothing, not time, not distance, not even the most cunning attempt at total anonymity, could keep the truth buried forever. It was a piece of the city's history that had been earned through struggle, through pain, and through an unwavering refusal to accept the darkness as the final word. It was a record of the human spirit's capacity to endure, to adapt, and to ultimately succeed against the most formidable of odds. For the detectives, the archive was not a cemetery, it was a library of lessons, a collection of stories that were now, finally and rightfully closed. They would look at the row of boxes and feel a sense of profound, settled accomplishment. The work was done. The debt was paid. The long, exhausting, and deeply transformative journey had reached its end, and in the quiet of the archives, the story of the 1991 Atlanta case would live on, not as a haunting, but as a monument to the unyielding, inevitable nature of the truth. The resolution of the Atlanta 1991 cold case had become the city's quietest legend, a narrative thread woven so deeply into the fabric of the police department that it was now indistinguishable from their collective institutional memory. The detectives who had finally brought the killer to justice often found themselves, years later, standing in the same office, now updated with sleek glass walls and high-speed data terminals, looking at the empty space on the shelves where the evidence boxes had once sat like gargoyles. It was a strange, disorienting experience to look at that shelf and see nothing but the hum of modern machinery. The case had been the ghost that lived in the ventilation, the reason for the late-night coffee and the furrowed brows, and its absence was, in a peculiar way, an act of erasure. They had won, but they had also lost the singular, defining focus that had unified the unit for so long. The transition from a world of uncertainty to one of resolution was not a singular event. It was a slow, cascading process that touched every aspect of their professional lives. The new recruits, who heard the story of the 1991 breakthrough in their initial training, would look at the older detectives with a mix of awe and mild skepticism. To the new guard, the idea of a 35-year mystery was a relic of a primitive era, a historical artifact that seemed as distant as the invention of the telephone. They didn't understand the visceral, grinding weight of waiting for a forensic match that might never come. They didn't grasp the psychological toll of carrying a victim's face in their wallet for decades. For the veterans, the 1991 case was not just a case, it was a bridge, a monument to a time when they were essentially throwing pebbles at the darkness, hoping for a sound. In the neighborhoods where the crime had occurred, the landscape had been irrevocably altered by time and development. The house that had been the site of the original horror was gone, replaced by a sprawling complex of luxury apartments that hummed with the busy, indifferent energy of the present. People who lived there now had no idea that they were walking over the site of one of the most significant criminal investigations in Atlanta's history. The investigators, driving through on patrols, would often pause for a second, their eyes tracing the layout of the old lot, a phantom map overlaid on the reality of the new construction. It was a reminder that history is not just preserved in books, it is etched into the very soil of the city, hidden beneath layers of asphalt, steel, and the collective amnesia of progress. Deep in the state prison, the killer, now an elderly man, existed in a state of terminal irrelevance. His life had become an endless, repetitive loop of institutional drudgery, meals, lockdowns, the monotonous passage of time. He was a man who had long ago run out of things to say, both to the world and to himself. The act of violence he had committed in 1991, once the central pillar of his secret identity, had become nothing more than a legal citation on a bureaucratic record. He had successfully outrun his past for 35 years, only to be overtaken by the very technology that he had failed to anticipate. He was now just a body in a cell, a cautionary tale that the guards told the new staff, a man whose existence was defined entirely by his lack of agency. The victim's family had reached a state of profound, quiet stability, having long ago transitioned from the sharp, jagged edges of trauma to the softer, more manageable landscape of memory. They were no longer the people who were defined by the search, they were individuals who had survived it. They had built lives that were robust and fulfilling, holding on to the memory of their loved one with a love that had outlasted the malice of the perpetrator. They often reflected on the investigation not as a struggle, but as a long, difficult pilgrimage. They had been accompanied by the detectives through the darkest parts of the path, and they remained connected to those investigators by the invisible, unbreakable bond of a shared, resolved history. They were the ones who had been given back their future, even if it was a future that would always be touched by the shadow of the past. The media, which had once treated the 1991 case as a sensational, high-octane drama, had largely moved on to the next set of headlines, leaving the story to become a dusty footnote in the archive of local crime. But for the people who had been in the thick of the investigation, the story was still alive. It was in the way they approached their new cases with a meticulous, almost paranoid level of detail. It was in the way they trained their younger colleagues, emphasizing that no lead was too small, no sample too degraded, and no case truly, finally, closed until the truth was standing in the light. They had been transformed by the 1991 case into a new kind of investigator, one who understood that the true enemy was not just the killer, but the entropy of time, and that the only way to defeat it was through an unyielding, irrational dedication to the facts. The laboratory teams had become the standard-bearers of this new philosophy. They were no longer just technicians. They were the guardians of the past. They operated with a level of precision that bordered on the obsessive, knowing that their work was the last, best hope for every victim whose case was currently gathering dust in the back of the archive. They viewed every sample as a conversation with history, a way of reaching across the years to find the truth that had been lost. Their work was the engine of the department's modern success, and they carried the legacy of the 1991 case as a standard to which all other evidence was measured. They were the ones who had turned the tide, and they knew that as long as they kept the machines running, the secrets of the past were never truly safe from being uncovered. As the years continue to turn, the 1991 case will likely pass into the realm of folklore, a story that gets slightly more exaggerated with each telling. But for the small, dedicated group of people who had been at the center of the search, it will always be something solid, something real, something that changed their lives in ways that no other event could. They had looked into the dark, they had waited for the light, and when the light finally came, they had used it to finish the work they had started so many years ago. The city of Atlanta moved on, the sky above it continued to shift, and the rhythm of life persisted, but in the halls of the precinct, the memory remained, a silent, respectful acknowledgement of the fact that they had once faced the impossible, and they had won. The story of 1991 was no longer a cold case. It was the story of the victory of the human spirit over the inevitable, and that, ultimately, was the only conclusion that mattered. The final chapter of the Atlanta 1991 case was never written in the pages of a courtroom ledger. It was written in the collective consciousness of a city that had finally exhaled. The resolution of the case did not bring with it the cinematic catharsis that the public had been conditioned to expect. Instead, it brought a heavy, quiet, and deeply profound sense of exhaustion. The investigators who had carried the burden of this ghost for 3.5 decades found themselves in a state of professional and personal suspension. They were like long-distance runners who had suddenly hit the finish line, only to find their legs were no longer accustomed to walking at a normal pace. The case had defined the rhythm of their careers. The 3 a.m. calls, the frantic coordination with the crime labs, the agonizing gaps of silence between leads, and its sudden removal created a silence that felt deafening. This silence was not empty. It was filled with the echoes of every choice they had made over the last 35 years. They walked through the squad room, now filled with the younger officers who viewed the 1991 resolution as a historical curiosity and felt a profound sense of temporal displacement. To these newcomers, the digital age of investigation was a baseline, a reality they couldn't imagine existing without. They didn't know the world of the paper file, the world of the slow, methodical, often frustrating manual search for information that was buried beneath layers of bureaucratic static. The veterans were the last of a dying breed, the ones who had learned to hunt in the shadows and had been forced to adapt to the blinding, analytical light of the modern era. They carried the memory of the cold, years like a physical weight, a reminder of the fragility of the truth when it is left to be eroded by time. The neighborhood where the crime had originally taken place had become a study in the persistence of urban change. The new structures that occupied the land were manifestations of progress, sleek, efficient, and devoid of the haunting history that had once marked the area. For the investigators, this was a complicated reality. They appreciated the renewal, the way the city was burying its darkest memories under layers of glass and steel, but they also felt a sense of protective guardianship over the site. They were the ones who still saw the phantom outline of the old crime scene beneath the new pavement. They were the ones who knew that no matter how much the city renovated, no matter how much it expanded, the foundational truths of its history remained fixed in the ground. They were the custodians of the past, tasked with ensuring that even as the city moved toward the future, it never completely lost the memory of the debt it had once owed to the victim of 1991. Deep within the penal system, the killer was experiencing the final, absolute crystallization of his own insignificance. He was a man who had staked his entire existence on the power of his secret, on the idea that he could carve out a life in the margins of society, untouched and untouchable. Now, he was the embodiment of what happens when the margin is folded back into the page. He was confined, controlled, and utterly forgotten by the world outside. The institutional environment had stripped away every layer of his persona, leaving only the bare, pathetic reality of a man who had traded his humanity for an illusion of control that was ultimately shattered by the relentless progression of technology. He was the perfect example of the cold case outcome. He had not just been caught, he had been rendered obsolete by the very world he had tried to exploit. The victim's family had reached a state of reflective peace that was both steady and deeply earned. They no longer searched for the truth, they lived with it. They had integrated the tragedy into the broader, more complex narrative of their lives, finding ways to honor the lost life without being consumed by the search for the killer. They had been the center of a public, often intrusive storm for decades, and their ability to reclaim their privacy and their autonomy was a testament to their resilience. They had seen the killer, they had heard the verdict, and they had processed the finality of it all. They were no longer waiting for anything. They were finally, after 35 years, free to live in the present, a gift that they had fought for with every ounce of their remaining strength. The media, as it always does, had moved on to newer, fresher tragedies, treating the resolution of the Atlanta 1991 case as a closed loop. But for the small, tight-knit circle of people who had been at the heart of the investigation, the story continued to inform every aspect of their current work. They were now the senior mentors in the department, the voices of experience that guided the next generation of investigators. They taught their recruits that the true battle in any case is not just against the perpetrator, but against the decay of memory itself. They emphasized that every piece of evidence, every interview, every scrap of documentation is a potential thread that, if pulled correctly, can unravel the most complex mystery. They were the keepers of the torch, ensuring that the lessons learned from the 1991 saga were passed down, becoming a part of the department's institutional DNA. The laboratory technicians, who had been the quiet engine behind the resolution, saw the case as a definitive turning point in the field of forensic science. They had watched as their ability to extract truth from degradation had evolved, moving from the limitations of the past to the near-total transparency of the present. They felt a sense of immense pride in their work, knowing that they had been the ones to finally translate the genetic language of the perpetrator into the clear, undeniable verdict of the court. Their focus was now on the future, on the new, emerging technologies that would make it even harder for any criminal to evade the reach of justice. They were the ones who had unlocked the door, and they were now working to ensure that no door would ever again remain as difficult to open. As the years continue to pass, the story of 1991 will eventually become a legend, a whispered piece of history that defines the department's commitment to its mission. It will be the benchmark of perseverance, a story told to remind everyone that justice is not an event, but a persistent, ongoing struggle. The investigators, as they eventually retire and move into the next stages of their lives, will take the memory of this case with them. It will be a part of their identity, a chapter in their internal narrative that they will carry forever. They had walked through the dark, they had faced the impossible, and they had emerged on the other side, not as the same people they had been, but as individuals who had learned the true, profound cost of the truth. And finally, the silence of the city returned to its natural, rhythmic state. The streets, the buildings, and the people all continued their movement, indifferent to the fact that a profound, deep-seated debt had been settled. The shadow that had once hung over the neighborhood was completely gone, replaced by the mundane, flickering lights of the modern, growing Atlanta. It was as it should be. The case was solved, the debt was paid, and the world continued its turn. But for those who had been there at the beginning, when the case was just a cold file, a cry for justice in the night, the memory of 1991 remained as a permanent, immovable anchor, a reminder that in a world often ruled by shadows, there is always the potential for the light to finally break through, provided there are people who refuse to look away. The story of 1991 was no longer a cold case. It was a testament to the fact that the truth, no matter how long it takes to find, is always waiting to be claimed. The finality of the Atlanta 1991 case did not settle over the city like a sudden curtain drop, but rather like the slow, almost imperceptible evaporation of a heavy morning mist. For 35 years, the weight of the unsolved had hung in the corners of the homicide department, a silent reprimand to every investigator who glanced at the storage shelves. Now, the space where that massive, yellowed file had rested for over 3 decades was empty, replaced by the clinical, thin geometry of a digital archive case marker. The physical paper, the handwritten notes from detectives who had long since passed away, the grainy Polaroids of a rain-slicked Atlanta street, the frantic sketches of a crime scene drawn under the flickering glow of emergency lights, had been processed, categorized, and tucked away into the permanent vault. It was the end of an era, a bureaucratic closing of a wound, but for the men and women who had spent their youth chasing a phantom, the silence left behind was a heavy, living entity that required its own form of navigation. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere had shifted into a state of quiet, reflective equilibrium. The frantic energy that had defined the days immediately following the DNA breakthrough had dissipated, leaving behind a profound sense of exhaustion that seemed to have settled into the very woodwork of the department. The lead investigators, men who had started their careers when the city's skyline was half its current height, sat at their desks, looking out over a room filled with a new generation of law enforcement. These younger officers moved through a world of instant digital communication, facial recognition databases, and real-time biometric tracking, a world where the idea of a 35-year-old mystery felt like an ancient legend from a distant, primitive century. For the veterans, the 1991 case was the final thread connecting them to an older, rougher style of policing, a time when investigations were driven by shoe leather, gut intuition, and the agonizingly slow accumulation of physical leads. They were the last keepers of that history, and the closing of the file felt like the final turning of a page they had been reading for a lifetime. Outside the walls of the police station, the city of Atlanta continued its relentless, upward expansion, indifferent to the ghosts that its progress was burying beneath layers of concrete and glass. The neighborhood that had once been paralyzed by the shock of the 1991 crime had been completely transformed by the forces of urban renewal. The old, weathered bungalows and overgrown vacant lots had been replaced by sleek, modern apartment complexes and manicured green spaces where young professionals walked their dogs, entirely oblivious to the tragedy that had occurred beneath their feet. The investigators would occasionally drive through these streets on their night patrols, pausing at the intersection where the yellow crime scene tape had once fluttered in the humid midnight air. It was a surreal experience to look at a thriving, brightly lit corridor of commerce and see, in the mind's eye, the dark, rain-soaked landscape of 35 years ago. It was a stark reminder that time is the ultimate eraser, capable of washing away the physical markers of human suffering, leaving only the memory of the truth to be guarded by those who refuse to let it go. Deep within the state's maximum security penal facility, the killer had begun the long, monotonous descent into total, terminal obscurity. The man who had spent more than 3 decades constructing an elaborate, flawless facade of suburban normalcy was now stripped of every prop, every mask, and every shred of personal agency. He was no longer the elusive phantom of 1991, the cold-blooded predator who had outsmarted a generation of detectives. He was simply an elderly inmate, a digit in a vast, indifferent ledger of the state's condemned. The absolute ironies of his existence were complete. He had spent his entire adult life running from the past, carefully managing his interactions, his employment, and his location to ensure that he remained invisible to the machinery of justice. Now, he was trapped in a world where visibility was absolute, where every movement was monitored by a lens, and where his final, permanent hiding spot was a 6x9 concrete box from which he would never escape. He had become a non-entity, a cautionary tale whispered by the guards to the new recruits, a man whose life had shrunk to the distance between his bunk and his cell door. For the family of the victim, the resolution of the case brought a quiet, settled peace that was entirely distinct from the dramatic closure often depicted in the media. They had lived for 35 years in a state of suspended animation, their grief frozen in the amber of the unknown. They had spent decades wondering if the person who had torn their world apart was sitting next to them at a diner, walking past them on a crowded sidewalk, or living just a few blocks away in the sprawling Atlanta suburbs. That agonizing, low-level static of suspicion had finally been turned off, replaced by the hard, cold, unyielding reality of a name, a face, and a conviction. They found that the truth did not erase the pain of their loss, nor did it return the 35 years of potential that had been stolen from their loved one. What it did provide was an anchor. They could finally stop looking over their shoulders, stop scanning the faces of strangers in a crowd, and begin the quiet, necessary process of mourning a person, rather than mourning a mystery. They had reclaimed their history, and in doing so, they had finally reclaimed their future. The laboratory technicians and forensic scientists who had provided the crucial, definitive link in the investigation viewed the 1991 breakthrough as a monumental validation of their discipline's evolution. They had spent years working in the quiet, climate-controlled rooms of the state lab, moving from the primitive, rudimentary chemical tests of the early 90s to the precise, molecular-level sequencing of the modern era. They knew that the evidence they had held in storage for 35 years was a message sent across time, a biological signature that was waiting for the world's technology to grow sophisticated enough to read it. The success of the 1991 case had transformed the way the department approached its entire archive of unsolved crimes. It proved that no case was truly dead as long as the integrity of the evidence was preserved, turning the property room from a cemetery of forgotten tragedies into a warehouse of sleeping truths, waiting for the right moment, the right tool, and the right mind to wake them up. As the months stretched into years following the final sentencing, the narrative of the Atlanta 1991 cold case began to pass from the front pages of the local news into the deeper, quieter realms of institutional folklore. It became the standard to which all other long-term investigations were compared, a textbook example of the power of persistence over the eroding effects of time. Instructors at the police academy would point to the 1991 file when teaching new cadets about the necessity of meticulous report writing, the absolute value of securing a crime scene, and the moral obligation that a detective carries the moment they pin on the badge. They would remind the young recruits that the promise made to a victim and their family does not have an expiration date, that the law does not stop running just because the calendar turns, and that the true measure of a department is its willingness to hunt for a truth that the rest of the world has forgotten. The veteran detectives who had lived through the entirety of the 35-year saga were now reaching the twilights of their own careers. One by one, they were packing up their desks, turning in their service weapons, and walking out of the precinct into the quiet of retirement. They carried with them the physical tolls of a lifetime spent in the shadows, the bad backs from long stakeouts, the gray hair earned during sleepless nights, and the subtle, permanent hypervigilance that is the hallmark of the homicide investigator. But they also carried a profound, unshakable sense of professional completion. They had faced the most elusive, cold-blooded specter in the city's history, a monster that had mocked their efforts for a generation, and they had lived to see him brought to justice. They had balanced the ledger for a family that had been waiting in the dark for 35 years, and that single, monumental achievement was enough to sustain them through the quiet years ahead. The final silence that settled over the city of Atlanta was not the heavy, ominous silence of an unresolved secret, but the clean, resting silence of a debt that had been fully paid. The streets, the towering skyscrapers, and the millions of people who called the metro area home continued their fast-paced, modern rhythm, completely oblivious to the historical struggle that had just drawn to its close. The case of 1991 was no longer an active file, no longer a source of frustration, and no longer a cold case. It had become a permanent monument to the unyielding, inevitable nature of human justice. It stood as a warning to anyone who believed that they could hide their malice in the dark corners of the city and outrun the calendar, proving that no matter how long the shadow, no matter how clever the deception, and no matter how many decades might pass, the light of truth is a patient, persistent hunter that will always, inevitably, find its way home.